The fulfillment of that promise of education in a language of choice must be reasonably practicable. And what reasonable practicability means and entails, and whether the University of the Free State was entitled to adopt the new language policy, lie at the heart of this application. It would be unreasonable to slavishly hold on to a language policy that has proved to be the practical antithesis of fairness, feasibility, inclusivity, and the remedial action necessary to shake racism and its tendencies out of their comfort zone. For these reasons, effective access to the right to be instructed in an official language of choice must be given effect to, but without undermining equitable access, preserving exclusivity, or perpetuating racial supremacy. It would be unreasonable to wittingly or inadvertently allow some of our people to have unimpeded access to education and success at the expense of others as a direct consequence of a blind pursuit of the enjoyment of the right to education in a language of choice. This in circumstances where all could properly be educated in one common language. At a conceptual level, dual medium institutions might well exist without necessarily nurturing or perpetuating unfair advantage or racial discrimination and its exceedingly harmful tendencies. When that is so, then the right to be taught in a language of choice could be effectively accessible and implemented. That, by the way, is what the university did or hoped to achieve when it moved from a dispensation of Afrikaans as the sole medium of instruction to one where English and Afrikaans enjoyed equal status as media of instruction. It did so to facilitate equitable access for the previously excluded who are mostly better acquainted with English so that they too could utilize this vital public resource for honing in their much needed skills. When the enjoyment of the right to be instructed in an official language of choice is achievable without undermining any constitutional aspiration or value, then the equity test might well have been met. The challenge could, however, arise when scarce resources are deployed to cater for a negligible number of students, affording them close, personal, and very advantageous attention, while other students are crowded into lecture rooms, where access, integration, and racial harmony are imperiled by giving effect to the right to be educated in an official language of choice, then the criterion of reasonable practicability would not have been met. Reasonable practicability, therefore, requires not only that the practicability test be met, but also that considerations of reasonableness that extend to equity and the need to cure the ills of our shameful apartheid past be appropriately accommodated. And that is achievable only if the exercise of the right to be taught in a language of choice does not pose a threat to racial harmony or inadvertently nurture racial supremacy. That goes to practicability. The question then is, has the use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction at the University of the Free State had a comfortable coexistence with our collective aspirations to heal the divisions of our past, or has it impeded the prospects of our unity in our diversity? Has race relations, particularly among students, improved or degenerated as a consequence of the university's 2003 language policy? If not, would it be reasonably practicable for the university to relegate Afrikaans to low-key utilization in a constitutionally permissible way? A conclusion that is embraced by many Afrikaners at all levels of the university community and in council is that the use of Afrikaans as a parallel language of instruction unwittingly perpetuates segregation and racism, open quotes, because it offends constitutional norms, close quotes. The policy does not work and has lost support because many Afrikaner students prefer English, which they see as a tool of communication that would enhance their prospects of being global players. Furthermore, it is quite telling that within 2 years of the implementation of the dual medium policy, the then rector of the university, Professor Fourie, expressed concern about the unintended consequences of the parallel medium policy giving rise to or entrenching segregation in lecture rooms along racial lines. He would have known whether that segregation was innocuous or toxic in its effect. Naturally, he would not have been concerned if it were not inimical to our shared constitutional vision of building a common sense of nationhood. Consistent with Professor Fourie's apparent discomfort, this policy eventually led to racial tension, and concerns were raised by both staff and students about its injurious consequences. Its counterproductive effect featured regularly in progress reports on dual medium policy implementation. Observations, daily experience, consultative processes in which Solidarity and AfriForum participated, and empirical research pointed to the need to progressively phase out Afrikaans as a medium of instruction. A particularly striking observation relates to what is not said about the need to consider all reasonable alternatives. That process would require that equitable access and the need to redress the effects of racism be taken into account in exploring all reasonable alternatives. Both Solidarity and AfriForum were involved in the admittedly transparent, inclusive, and robust consultative process. There is no suggestion that they, any stakeholder or language expert, tabled any constitutionally compliant alternative and that it was ignored. And it is hard to imagine why the university would ignore known or available reasonable alternatives in wanton disregard for its constitutional obligations, particularly when the change it is effecting takes away a pre-existing entitlement. The only reasonable deduction to make from the non-implementation of any alternative that would allow the full retention of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction is that, but for its continued use in education, theology, and tutorials, no other reasonable alternative was available for the university to consider. The university authorities, lecturers, students' intimate connection to or daily experience on campus put them at a vantage point to understand better and speak with respectable authority on the true state of affairs in their own house, in quotes. Whether white Afrikaner students have demonstrated respect for the dignity of fellow students who are black in their daily interactions over the years, and whether a credible or vital connection has been made between racially segregated classes and racial tensions alluded to, the university community would know better. Racial inclusivity and redressing the damage caused by racism and its tendencies are a critical component of the ministerial policy. The implementation of any language policy that undermines these constitutional and policy objectives has to be desisted from. And the university is in effect saying that President Mandela's worst nightmares have come to pass. The use of Afrikaans has unintentionally become a facilitator of ethnic or cultural separation and racial tension. And this has been so from around 2005 to 2016. Its continued use would leave the results of white supremacy not being redressed but kept alive and well. It is for that reason that a policy revision or intervention has since become necessary. The link between racially segregated lectures and racial tension has not been denied. While it may be practicable to retain Afrikaans as a major medium of instruction, it certainly cannot be reasonably practicable when race relations are poisoned thereby. Logic dictates that if there was a known way of addressing racial tension and other concerns relating to the use of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction, it would not only have been stated by the aggrieved parties, but also implemented. So, The challenge based on the correct meaning of reasonably practicable must fail. This then leaves us with the alternative grounded on the alleged inconsistency between the ministerial policy framework and the university policy. The university's impugned language policy is challenged on the basis that it flouts the essence of the ministerial policy and was therefore not developed subject to it. In particular, it is contended that the university's policy has strayed from the ministerial policy framework by phasing out Afrikaans as one of the two dominant languages of instruction when it should be retaining and not eroding it. That, by the way, is essentially the basis on which the High Court ruled in favor of AfriForum and Solidarity. Their full support for the retention of Afrikaans as a medium of academic expression and communication in higher education was no doubt informed by what was known and hoped for when the ministerial policy framework was developed and published. And so was the commitment to ensure that the capacity of Afrikaans to function as a medium is not eroded. That position was thus inspired by the context of that time. Would these policy provisions prevent an institution of higher learning from revising its policy and prescribing English as the only medium of instruction even when no student wanted to be taught in Afrikaans? What if racial polarization or tension has for years proved to be a direct consequence of using Afrikaans as the second medium of instruction and all reasonable endeavors to address it have failed? What if there were widely televised incidents of crass racism at the University of the Free State perpetrated by white Afrikaner students against black students or black staff members that drove a chill down the spines of well-meaning South Africans of all races? Would the university still be constrained by the ministerial policy framework from acting in line with changed circumstances and the Constitution? The ministerial policy framework highlights the need to ensure that a language of instruction is not a barrier to access and success. And there has already been a concern raised about access. One crucial aspect of the ministerial policy is the constitutional proviso, open quotes, that these rights may not be exercised inconsistently with any provision of the Bill of Rights, close quotes. The other inbuilt constitutional qualifiers are the Section 29(2) criteria, like reasonably practicable, as well as equity, practicability, and the need to redress the results of the past racially discriminatory laws and practices. Here, the university community, council, and senate in particular have satisfied themselves that instead of the dual language policy brightening up the prospects of redressing the damage caused by apartheid, it threatens to perpetuate racial discrimination or disharmony. The retention of the dual medium of instruction was neither considered to be fair nor feasible, nor to satisfy the need to remedy the results of apartheid laws and practices. So, the university was at risk of violating poignant constitutional provisions and the ministerial language policy properly understood. Nobody is to blame for the outturn of racially segregated lectures. It is the old policy itself that yielded deleterious and certainly unintended consequences. The good sought to be achieved through a parallel medium of instruction has backfired. The retention of that policy is therefore no longer reasonably practicable since it does not help students, open quotes, to build a common sense of nationhood consistent, close quotes, with the ministerial policy framework in its entirety. The university's new language policy responds to the materialized warning sounded by the ministerial policy framework itself, that unintended consequences could flow from a well-intentioned attempt to be as inclusive and sensitive in relation to language as institutions of learning should always strive to be. Unjust denial of access and racial and narrow cultural segregation has become the consequence of seeking to have Afrikaans-speaking students enjoy their own constitutional rights to be taught in their official language of choice. Afrikaans as a medium of instruction has unwittingly become an instrument of racial or cultural division and discrimination. The university's language policy was determined subject to and is thus consistent with the ministerial policy framework and the Constitution of the Republic. Its adoption is lawful and valid. In a dissenting judgment, Froneman J. Cameron J. and Pretorius A.J. concurring took the view that the Constitutional Court ought to have set this matter down for hearing. He considered that such an approach would have enhanced the legitimacy of the outcome and better reflected the court's practice. He also would have granted leave to appeal on the basis that the applicant's case bore prospects of success and in any event concerns unfinished business under the Constitution. Froneman J. stressed the broader context in which this matter arose and pointed out that the Constitutional Court has never held that the mere exercise of a constitutionally protected language right can amount to unfair racial discrimination that would necessarily justify taking away that right. He noted that the parties do not accept the Supreme Court of Appeal's interpretation of Section 29(2) of the Constitution. He drew attention to unclear factual issues and regretted that these had not been fully ventilated. He also regretted that other institutions and organizations had not been given an opportunity to make submissions. Froneman J. closed his judgment by noting that, on the papers as they stood, he would have reserved costs and referred this matter back to the High Court so that additional evidence could be taken. He expressed his hope that the outcome of this matter will not undermine the development of languages other than Afrikaans and English as languages of higher learning. I beg your pardon. In a passage written in Afrikaans, he doubted the effectiveness of the applicant's conduct, and noting the diverse history of Afrikaans, he called on young people to lead a, open quotes, derde taalbeweging, close quote, in brackets, third language movement for an inclusive Afrikaans short of racial and other prejudices. The following order is made. 1, leave to appeal is refused. 2, there will be no order as to costs, and I hand down this judgment. Thank you. Thank you.